Operations is where modeling railroads is separated from modeling railroad objects. Operations entails not only the realistic control of the movement of trains on the railroad, but also the forwarding of cars that make up those trains. As we can see from this image of a busy and congested model railroad yard, clearly indicating to the operators where cars need to go and what trains need to be put in is no small task. In this video, I'd like to describe how we handle car forwarding on the N-scale Columbia and Western Railroad.
Hi, I'm Mark Dance and this is the Columbia and Western Railroad, and today I'd like to talk about car forwarding and a system that we developed for the Columbia and Western that kind of meets the specific needs that we have. This video is a partner to the article that appears in the April 2014 edition of the Dispatcher's Journal. Here I'm going to try and explain how the spreadsheet was developed that's used to actually determine the loading on the car forwarding system, and also walk through how the layout, the cars are actually retagged as I restate the layout between operating sessions.
It might be helpful to talk about the original objectives I had with a car forwarding system. I model in N-scale, and I find it personally very difficult to read the car numbers. I also have a large number of very similar 40-foot CP boxcar red boxcars, and I wasn't about to begin individually numbering each of them. This made it very difficult for me to imagine using a car card system that relied upon being able to read individual car numbers. I also have a yard where the track spacing is a scale 13 feet, making it very difficult to be able to read between cars. Now, these needs are not particularly unique amongst N-scale railroaders, so I looked first to the local N-scale operators to see how they were handling car forwarding. I figured whatever worked for them would likely work for me, and I'd have a ready supply of trained operators to draw from. There are two very well-known N-scale model railroads in the Vancouver area. The first is Steve Stark's Esquimalt and Nanaimo, and the second is Brian Morgan's Burlington Northern Cascades subdivision. At the time I began operating the Columbia and Western, both of these gentlemen were using Avery labels to mark the tops of the cars and indicate to which industries or staging locations the cars were to be delivered. This seemed like a pretty good approach to me and would meet all of my initial objectives. So I set about developing a color and mnemonic scheme that I would print on top of inkjet printed labels that could be stuck on top of the cars. The schema involves a combination of both colors as well as numbers and letters. The colors indicate the direction that the cars are to be forwarded towards, while the numbers and letters indicate the on-layout destination for the cars. For clarity, if there are no numbers and letters on the sticker, then it indicates an end staging destination. This diagram shows the schema and is posted on the valance around the layout in a variety of places, especially above the division point of Nelson. Nelson is represented by white labels. If cars are to make their way to specific locations in Nelson Yard or industries around the yard, then in addition to having a white label, there will also be a combination of letters and numbers that specify the industry. In a similar manner, cars for the boundary subdivision are all labeled orange. Those eventually making their way to off-layout staging areas will be solid orange, whereas cars that are for on-layout switching will be a combination of orange as well as a mnemonic indicating the town and the switching location along the boundary subdivision. Cars for the Nelson subdivision east to Cranbrook will be solid blue. Cars for the Burlington Northern to Spokane would be Cascade green. Any cars to be switched on the Caslow and Slocan subdivisions will be gray, etc., etc. So I bought a bunch of Avery labels, and I used the Avery software to reproduce this schema onto those labels. We used this system for several years, and I guess from an operator point of view, if you ignored the labels curling up on the tops of the cars, it worked pretty well. One of the operational aids that we introduced were the trifold train instructions. There is one trifold pamphlet for each job that's run on the Columbia and Western. This image shows both the back and the front of the clipboard that holds the train instruction. The clipboard also has a lanyard, which can be used to hang the clipboard around the operator's neck, leaving their hands free to operate a throttle, to uncouple cars, or hold a beer. This image shows both the front and back of one of the trifold train instructions. One section of the train instruction included the color and mnemonic for every industry that was located along the route of the job. Of course, these color and mnemonics would also be the same as the labels that would be on tops of the cars in their train. However, we identified at a very early date that this might not be adequate, especially for trains that were originating in hidden staging before making their way onto the layout. So we included another section in the train instructions for an opening wheel report, which could also be used as a switch list. As I mentioned, we used this label system for several years, and it worked pretty well. However, after VanRail 2011, where I spent 4 or 5 hours restaging the layout between 3 back-to-back days of operations, I decided I needed to revisit the car forwarding system. Restaging was just taking too long. I found it was easier to move whole trainloads of cars back to their original spot between sessions than it was to unpeel a label from the top of a car and then to stick a new label on top. Additionally, the labels did leave a residue, and I had just finished weathering 400 pieces of rolling stock, so I wasn't about to start sticking labels on them if I could avoid it. So with the help of some very experienced operators in the local Vancouver area, I began revisiting the whole car forwarding system and started to look at switch lists to see what would be necessary to make those work on the Columbia and Western. Initially, a switch list approach held the most promise. It looked really interesting because I could use a computer to be able to accurately model the loads and shipments for the prototype's industries. However, we were stuck with how we would use a switch list system if the cars weren't uniquely numbered and if the numbers were difficult to read. Finally, as is pretty common, we have single operator crews on the Columbia and Western, which means one operator is responsible for operating not only the locomotive, but also figuring out all the switching moves and keeping track of all the cars in the trains. While this is feasible for the road crews, I was very worried about how this would work in the yard. In brainstorming sessions with those experienced local operators, we kept coming back to a switch list approach likely requiring some form of yard clerk position for Nelson Yard. That yard clerk's job would be to take the paperwork from the incoming trains, keep all of it straight in their heads, and to build the wheeled reports that the yard crews would then use to build the outgoing trains. I was worried about this position because it was purely administrative, and I didn't have a lot of space or heat capacity for an additional body in the railroad room. An alternative to a yard clerk might be to use a computer system, perhaps JMRI Ops, to tell the yard crews exactly which tracks to put each car on an incoming train. But an approach like that seemed overly prescriptive, and I wanted the yard crews to be able to come up with creative solutions without having to follow exactly what a switch list prescribed to them in terms of which car needed to go to which track. So the revision of the car forwarding system was effectively at a standstill. Fortunately, I attended Northern Rail's 2012 in Edmonton, Alberta. It was there that I had a bit of a breakthrough, courtesy of two things. First was operating on Scott Szabo's Feather Mountain Railroad. Scott has an N-scale layout and uses JMRI Ops to create switch lists that dictate where the cars need to go. However, he also allows his yard crews to place tags on the tops of the cars on the incoming trains that tell the yard crews to which outgoing trains those cars are then assigned. The second part of the breakthrough was listening to Scott at a session that evening talking about the pros and cons of JMRI Ops and how it worked. The JMRI Ops program wasn't going to work for me for a couple of reasons. The first being the need to be able to read those car numbers. The second was, as I understand it, JMRI Ops is more car-centric in terms of being able to tell the operators exactly where each car needs to go. It doesn't really take into consideration the modeling of the industries, and that was something that I wanted to be able to do. However, what Scott had done is elegantly combine a couple of strong points of two different systems in ways that made sense for his layout. And that started me thinking about what the different elements of a car forwarding system might be. During Scott's session that evening, I started thinking about what are the different things that make up car forwarding. I postulated that perhaps we could break it into three sections. The creation of demand to simulate the industry's need for cars, the assignment of the cars that are available to that demand and their release, and then finally a way to actually mark those cars so that the operators knew where they needed to go. If we were to break car forwarding systems down into these three steps, maybe we could use different approaches for each of those three steps and combine them in interesting hybrid ways. For example, JMRI Ops uses a computer and database to assign cars to different routes and industries in ways that simulate demand. It can then output switch lists, which crews can use to identify the cars and make sure they're going in the right direction and delivered to the right industries. Scott had refined this approach. Instead of using the built-in functionality in GemRI Ops to tell the yard crews exactly which tracks each car needed to go to, he'd used the age-old approach of tagging the tops of the cars so that the yard crews could then easily see which N-scale car needed to be made up into which train, and they could then use their own creativity to figure out how to do that. Thinking about the traditional four-cycle car card system in this way shows us why it's so attractive, because it's one technology that can be used for all three different steps of the car forwarding system. However, in spite of their attractiveness, four-cycle car cards just weren't for me. I don't like handling car cards, I can't read the car numbers, and it doesn't really allow me to simulate the input and output of the industries I'm modeling to my liking. Thinking about car forwarding in this manner, we can see how other hybrid approaches can be generated. For example, using computer systems to generate the demand and then create waybills which might be put into car pockets from which switch lists are generated by the operators. If we think about car forwarding in this way, the sky's the limit and we can create a variety of hybrid approaches picking on the strengths of the different systems that are available or coming up with new approaches that allow us to completely customize car forwarding to meet our specific needs. Those sessions in Northern Rails freed me to realize that I didn't need to pick a one-size-fits-all approach, but I could pick and choose the elements that I like best from all the different approaches that are out there. For example, I could use a computer system to accurately model the prototype industry's demand, and then I could replace my Avery labels with tags similar to what Scott was using. Once I had those tags, they could actually act as a form of writing waybill, and if I had more waybills indicating more demand than I had cars, I could accumulate those tags somewhere until there were enough cars to meet the need. This was starting to look really promising, and I liked the idea of being able to accumulate excess demand and either assign cars as it became available or place that demand on staging. So what are the elements of the system? Well, I would be able to retain the car forwarding schema that I developed for the labels. No need to change that. We used the same approach for the tags as Scott. They're 5 scale foot long lengths of 3/16 inch plastruct channel. To color them, I use an airbrush with appropriate color to meet the schema, and if they're to have a mnemonic on top of them, I print that on transparent material using a label printer. Once the label is affixed, I can trim it to size and then hit it with dull coat to improve the surface. They fit nicely on top of the running boards of an N-scale boxcar, and they fit pretty well and hold tight on top of a tank car. The only time they'll come off is if a train is derailed. I store the labels in a bead bin I got from Michaels, and then the whole thing can roll around on a laptop computer cart, one of the best purchases I've ever made. At the top of this photo you can see the row of paper cups I use to accumulate the excess tags, if I have more demand than I have cars to fill. I glue a row of paper cups down, and then I can put other paper cups inside them loosely so that they can be easily removed to dump the tags into my hand for handling or to dump the tags into other cups if I have to place the demand on stations further up the line. And that brings us to the final element of the system, which is the computer spreadsheet that determines the types and numbers of tags that are pulled. It's written in Excel, and although there are a number of sheets, they're relatively straightforward. There are 3 types of sheet. The first is an overview sheet, where I can see the random number set that's being selected, and I can see the car loads that are being generated as a result of those random numbers. It's easy to see in one place how the combinations of certain random numbers will increase or decrease the number of cars moved by each job, and overall how difficult a session might be. The middle set of sheets are the job sheets, and this is where all the math resides to decide for each industry how many cars are required and where they're going to come from, and how many cars are going to be generated and where they're going to go to. The last set of sheets are summaries that show the number of cars that are going to be coming from the staging locations. The job sheets are where all the math resides. For each switching job on the Columbia and Western, there's one sheet. Each job lists the towns, then the industries, then the individual industry spots that each job serves. Further, each car type that's accepted or shipped from each industry spot is also listed and has its own row. I use the AAR designations for each car type. The job sheets have 2 sides, the demand side showing the demand for cars of that car type at each industry spot, and the supply side which shows the supply of the cars of that car type from that industry spot. The demand for cars at any industry spot is determined by adding the minimum amount, which is the steady state demand, to a variable amount, which changes based upon the random number value that's selected. If there are options for where those demanded cars can come from, I can use another random number to determine that. The supply side for each industry spot starts with the number of cars that should be present there. I simply copy this column from the demand column from the previous session. If the number of cars that are actually at that industry spot doesn't match what's in the spreadsheet for what should be there, that's not a big deal. It means the cars are on their way, they've either been respot or misspot. I can just ignore it, trusting that the tags will make sure they eventually get to where they need to go. Finally, the spreadsheet has to decide where cars are going to be shipped to. If there are options, then we can use another random number to help decide amongst those different options, and then specify the color of the tag that's going to be placed on those cars. Adding up all the cars on the demand side and then all the cars on the supply side gives a pretty good indication of how difficult the job is going to be. And that can be displayed on the front overview sheet. I use Excel's conditional formatting function to change the color of the cells representing each job as it becomes more or less difficult. If it's easy, it's green. If it's normal, it's blank. If it's difficult, it begins pink and then gets progressively darker. The 4 random numbers are in the upper yellow box. The jobs and the number of cars each job handles are in the white box below it. These numbers will change dynamically as the random numbers change and alter the number of cars supplied or demanded. The graphic in the top right-hand corner is just a static representation of how difficult each job becomes as the average of the random numbers increases. I just use it as a guideline when I'm trying to figure out what I want my average of my random numbers to be. Now we can see one of the strengths of using a spreadsheet for this. By changing the random numbers, we can immediately see what the impact is going to be on the difficulty of each of the jobs. If we want an easy session, we can pick a low average for all the random numbers. If the average increases, we can see that the jobs are becoming more and more difficult. I've found that an average load of about 30%, at least for the numbers I've used, provides a good, workable session. So I generally will hone in on something like that. The final sheets are the staging summary sheets. There's one for each staging location, so in my case Cranbrook, which is shown here, and Spokane. Because we developed each job sheet by car type, we can actually summarize how many cars of what car type are going to be required from each staging location for each job. There's no new math here, it's just adding up all the job sheets.
I'm now going to demonstrate how the tag and spreadsheet system works by restaging Castlegar, and specifically the pulp mill in Castlegar, which takes a large number of cars during an operating session. I would first have restaged all the open top cars. So the loads have to go back to where the loads are, and the empties are restaged to the empties, or I just swap the loads one or the other. But I'm actually going to demonstrate with the closed top cars, because that's where the tags really shine. So the first thing I do is I come to Castlegar. I've brought my bin of tags, and also my little cups for me to determine where I'm going to place the demand. And I brought a copy of Spreadsheets, and I have one sheet that's just for the craft job, which works the Castlegar area, and in Castlegar there is the Celgar craft mill, which is the area I'm going to focus on. So I look at the cars and I determine whether they're in the right locations. I've marked each of the tracks with the same tags that the cars that are meant to go there will have. So for example, here I've got Celgar 6 track, and in there I look and say, oh, what do you know, all the cars with Celgar 6 have been properly located. So I just simply pull all those tags, and then I look at the Celgar 5 track, and it has correctly spotted all the right tags. If any of the cars had the wrong tags, I would just leave them, because then it's up to the next job to come and replace those. So I take that and I actually will dump the Celgar 6 and 5 in that track. Then I look at Celgar 4. Well, these ones have been properly positioned, which is great. But I have another Celgar 4 car here, which is waiting to be loaded, and I'll just leave that tag on there, because that's got to be spotted by the crew next time. Do the same with the chemical tracks. This is for the sulfuric acid that's brought from Trail. These are Celgar 8, and those have been properly spotted in Celgar 7 as well. So I'll put those Celgar 7 and Celgar 8 in the correct locations. Celgar 9, yeah, that one's been properly spotted. So that goes away. And then I look, oh, on the West Robson tracks, there's 2 cars for Celgar 5. That's not in the right location. Those are off spots. Those are going to have to wait for the next session to be properly spotted. So I've now cleared all the cars. So now what I do is I look and say, where do those cars have to go? Now in most cases, those cars are going to go to the same place. So I know from memory exactly where they need to go. I know the sulfuric acid cars need to go back to Trail. So I'll put pink tags on there, like that. But I can also check, and I can see, because in some cases cars go to different places. So I have 2 cars there for the outbound chemical tracks, and I can see one of them has to go back to Cranbrook, so that's a blue tag, but one of them is going to Spokane, and that's a green tag. So if I did have any questions about where they need to go, I can consult the spreadsheet, and that will tell me where they need to go. Put a green tag on that one, and a blue tag on that one. And you can get the general gist of how that all works. So that's how the shipping works, and in general the cars are going back to the same spot, so it becomes very, very quick to be able to replace the tags with where they need to go. But let me deal with a couple other things. Now I'm going to deal with the demand side. So I'm looking at Celgar 6 and Celgar 5, and I'm saying how many cars are they going to need? Well, they're going to need 2 for both, because my spreadsheet shows me that I need 2 for Celgar 5 and 2 for Celgar 6. So I pull back out the tags, 2 of each. And the first thing I do is I look and say, are there any empty 40-foot boxcars that are viable to be used for those loads? I look around, don't see any. All right, so where do they go? They go into the Nelson 40-foot boxcar cup, because I'm going to take those back to Nelson with me. I'm going to see if there's any empty 40-foot boxcars that are appropriate. Then I look and say, all right, what about Celgar 4? I've got 2 shipments. Those ones are going to go. I will tag those at some point. I look and see what is required. Oh, I need 1 car, empty car, to be shipped out of there because that's pulp. And I look around, do I have an empty car? Yes, I do. I have this Great Northern car, and what do you know, it actually needs to be routed to south of the border, so it's got to go to Spokane anyways. So I'm going to tag that with a Spokane tag. No, sorry, I'm going to tag that with a Celgar 4 tag, which is what that one requires. And now I've grabbed a suitable car from a local supply, and that will then be routed by the crew as an off spot. And once that's full, it'll go to Spokane and it'll be shipped south. So I deal with all of the industries at Castlegar in this way, and then I will accumulate either cars that are going to be going back to Nelson, or if they're special cars. So for example, Celgar 7, which is the chemical track, I look and say, hey, that needs 2 cars. So I'm going to pull 2 tags for Celgar 7, and these ones are not of a car type that's going to be inventoried at Nelson, so that will go directly into the Cranbrook Cup, so that when I go to restage the train in from Cranbrook, I'll have 2 cars that are going to be requisitioned, that are going to be tank cars, because I know that's what Celgar 7 takes, that are going to have to come from Cranbrook and make their way to Nelson and eventually make their way to Castlegar. So now we'll go to Nelson's yard and we'll show how we restage the Nelson yard and put demand on the Nelson cars. So we've dealt with all the towns on the Columbia and Western, just like we dealt with Castlegar, and now we've made our way back to Nelson, the division point, accumulating all the additional cars that we need to fulfill the needs of the industries along the way. So Nelson we treat in pretty much the same way we've treated every town so far, at least for the first part of it. So we pull the Nelson sheet and we go to all the different industries and we see whether the cars have been properly spotted or not. So I'm just going to deal with a small section here to give you the idea. So I look and see, all right, well, there's the oil car that's been spotted at the oil arrival track for the diesel house, and it's been spotted correctly. So I've taken the tag off that, and I look and see, oh, well, next time we need 2 cars to be delivered there, and they'll be coming from Cranbrook. So I pick 2 tags, oil tags, and I drop them into the Cranbrook little cup. So these are 4 cars that are being pulled in from Cranbrook that can't be fulfilled locally. You know, obviously we don't generate oil in Nelson, so it has to come from points further east. And I look at the clean-out track and I see that all the cars at the clean-out track have been properly spotted, so I pull those as well. And then I look at the requisition cars for the clean-out track. In addition to the 7 tags I pulled, I see actually I need 3 more. I need 10 cars in total, and they'll be coming from Cranbrook, and they'll be making up some of the demands. So we'll be pulling in some cars that need to be cleaned. I'll take those. I'm going to put those into the Cranbrook 40-foot boxcar cup. Now I've got these 7 cars that are actually available now to be requisitioned by some of the industries up the line. So I take the Nelson 40-foot boxcar cup with all the tags that we've accumulated to date, and I can start assigning them. So I see there's 3 for Grand Forks. So I drop the 3 Grand Forks tags on there, like that. And I see that in addition there's 3 more for the Spokane branch. So I'll drop those. These are for industries at the Slocan lumber mill in Slocan City. So this is part of the reason why the 40-foot cars are inventoried in Nelson, is because it's a very, very common car type that's needed by the industries along the line. And I have one car left over. Actually, I don't have any cars left over, but I have a bunch of tags left over, and these ones are for the pulp mill in Castlegar and other industries. So we don't have enough boxcars available currently in the Nelson yard to fulfill that, so I'm going to put those, along with those cleanout tags, into the Cranbrook 40-foot boxcar. So that's how we deal with Nelson, and we'll go through all the different industries and clear it all out, and we'll allocate any available cars to the demand, and any additional demand for any of the standard cars, be they flat cars or hopper cars that we can't meet locally. We take those cups and we dump them into the Cranbrook cup, and then we make our way to Cranbrook, and we make up the trains necessary to come in.
Okay.
So this brings us to the final step of the restaging process, and this is really the only fiddling of the cars other than the open top cars that we need to deal with. It's completely different from the way I used to do the restaging. This is really what saves me all the time. So we really only have two off-layout origination points for the Columbia Western. We have Cranbrook, which is the CP destination to the east, which also includes the UP interchange at York, and we have Spokane. So Spokane is in the crew lounge, so I'm going to deal only with the stuff that's in the Cranbrook cups right now. So we have a storage yard that's underneath Castlegar, and it feeds the layout through a couple of helixes, and there's an indexing table here. Pull that down. So what I need to do now is I actually need to make up the train from Cranbrook that's going to come in at the beginning of the session to feed all the cars into the layout that are necessary. So I can start by looking. These are all the 40-foot box cars. These are the different tags. So what I can see is I actually have 4, 6, 10, 15 cars. So I'll actually fiddle the train by taking 15 box cars and using these re-railers here, putting them on the tracks. And I'll put the train together like that. And I'll make it up, and I'll put the tags onto all the different cars. I won't do it physically now because of the time. You get the idea. I also can see that maybe I've got some gondolas as well. So I'll pull the tags from that, pick a gondola, put it on the tracks, drop in the tag, and that cup's done. So this is how I handle the standard cars. Now I also have this dedicated car. So this is stuff that's coming from Cranbrook that isn't normally warehoused. And I can see by looking at this, I have a couple of oil tags for Nelson, so I know I'm going to need tank cars. So I'll go grab a couple of tank cars and put on the oil tags. And I can see I've got tags for Celgar 7. If you recall, that's the chemical track, so those are tank cars as well. So I'll peel the appropriate tank cars, put those on, and fill the train together. And when it's all done, the train from Cranbrook has been completed. So that completes the restaging process using the tags and spreadsheets.
That's what the revised car forwarding system entails, and that's a demo of how it works. I've been using it now to restage the layout for about a year, and I've been pretty happy with it. So let's summarize with the pros and cons of the approach. Moving from labels to tags and accumulating the excess demand in the cups means now I only have to fiddle the trains that are originating and staging. This has saved me at least an hour to an hour and a half of restaging time. Just as with the labels, the tags mean the operators don't need to read car numbers. They can clearly see where a car has to go. And just like labels, the tags mean I don't have to worry about cars going to the wrong locations. With the tags on top, the operators will always act to move the cars towards where they need to go. Because the tags act as an ultimate reference, and I don't need to worry about car numbers, I have no need for a database that needs to be kept completely synchronized with what's actually occurring on the layout and where cars actually are. The lack of a database means I can use a simple spreadsheet while still using a computer to accurately model the supply and demand from each industry. Yard classification is not the bottleneck. The yard crews don't need to read car numbers or handle car cards, and they can focus on creatively and efficiently putting the trains together, seeing easily which cars need to make their way into which trains. In fact, the departure sheet for Nelson Yard is also color-coded, so crews can quickly see which trains are coming up and which color cars they're going to have in those trains. The tags act as waybills that ride with the cars, so there's no additional paperwork for the operators to carry. And finally, the system is very easy to learn at a glance. Here, for example, we see a train where the first two cars are for Castlegar because they're yellow tagged, and the balance are all heading to Cranbrook because of their blue tags. So what has the feedback been like, and what are the downsides? I haven't heard many complaints. Maybe people are just being polite. The few that I have heard have been comments regarding the appearance of the tags and how people just don't like them. I think many operators look past them, but some people, they just feel it's going in the wrong direction. The second is, although the tags act effectively like waybills, there's no information conveyed to the operators regarding what are the contents of the cars, and some people like to know that. A third might be the lack of paperwork. Railroads, at least in my era, used a lot of paperwork to get things done. While practice has allowed me to get pretty efficient at restaging using this system, I have to admit that were I to implement a 4-cycle car card system, it would take me less time to restage. Thinking about it a bit, but without any real experience with them, I would expect that the newer waybill in-car pocket systems take about the same amount of time to restage as this approach. And they probably also take longer to restage than a 4-cycle car card system. However, against both the waybill and the 4-cycle car card system, I have to consider the overall amount of time that myself and all the operators spend. I estimate that it takes me about an hour longer to restage the layout using this system than it would if I were to employ 4-cycle car cards. But if I think about the amount of time that 6 or 7 operators over a 3-hour session spend handling car cards and reading car numbers, I think I'm definitely getting a payback on that investment.
So that's how the restaging process for the Columbia and Western works with the tags and the cups and the spreadsheets. I hope you found something useful in it. I think for applications like mine, where you either have non-unique car numbers or car numbers that are too small to read, or you have a lot of operators who are unfamiliar with car card systems, or a yard that's relatively dense and difficult to read the car numbers in, it might be a useful approach. There's pros and there's cons. For me, having used the system for about a year, it's met all my objectives, and it's allowed me to shave a huge amount of time off the restaging process, which is really its key objective, while still being very, very easy to use. While some operators might be concerned about the visual impact, most of the operators, maybe they're just being polite, they've not mentioned it, and it certainly makes it easy for them to do their jobs. So I think it's increased the overall fun level, perhaps, of the layout versus using a different system. If you have any questions, you can always reach me at email, mark.dance@gmail.com. And again, I hope you found something useful in this video. Thanks for watching.